"Give me the rifle, son," said the veteran. The Marine smiled, and then saw the Delta emblem. Sometimes the most dangerous mistake is underestimating a man based on his trembling hands and weathered face, and the most sacred symbols are worn by those who never speak of the blood and sacrifice they represent. This is the story of how 2 words and 10 perfect shots revealed that legends don't die. They simply wait quietly for the moment when the young must learn that courage, skill, and honor cannot be measured by youth or dismissed by arrogance. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The California sun hammered down on Marine Corps Range 7 with the kind of relentless heat that made even experienced Marines question why their training schedule had been set for the hottest part of the afternoon. The rifle range stretched across barren hillside terrain, with targets positioned at various distances that challenged even the most skilled marksmen to demonstrate precision under conditions that tested both technical ability and mental discipline. 83-year-old Philip Lawson sat on a weathered wooden bench at the edge of the range, his aged hands resting on his knees with the slight tremor that came inevitably with advanced years. But despite the visible effects of age on his body, his pale blue eyes remained sharp and focused as he watched the distant targets with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing far more than simple paper circles at measured distances. Philip wore a faded veteran's jacket despite the oppressive heat, the fabric worn thin by decades of use but maintained with obvious care. On the shoulder of the jacket was an embroidered patch so faded by time and exposure that its design was barely visible. A ghostly silhouette overlaid on what appeared to be a river delta map, surrounded by symbols that had lost their definition but retained their significance to anyone who understood their meaning. The young Marines, conducting qualification training, had noticed the elderly visitor early in their session, and their initial curiosity had gradually transformed into mockery as they observed his trembling hands and aged appearance in a facility dedicated to demonstrating physical capability and martial skill. Corporal Jake Jenkins, a 24-year-old Marine with 2 deployments and the aggressive confidence that came from believing his recent combat experience made him an authority on military service, led the verbal harassment with comments that grew progressively crueler as his fellow Marines encouraged the performance. "Hey, old-timer," Jenkins called out loudly enough for other Marines to hear and appreciate his wit. "You looking for the retirement home? I think you took a wrong turn about 10 miles back." Several younger Marines laughed at Jenkins' joke, their amusement amplified by the group dynamic that made cruelty feel like camaraderie when directed at someone outside their immediate circle. Private Rodriguez, the youngest member of the group at 19, felt uncomfortable with the mockery, but lacked the confidence to challenge his corporal's behavior in front of their peers. Philip looked toward the young Marines with an expression that showed neither anger nor embarrassment at their comments. His weathered face remained calm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet courtesy of someone who had no need to prove anything to anyone. "Just waiting for someone, boys. Thought I might do a little shooting while I wait, if that's permitted." The suggestion that this trembling elderly man intended to shoot sent another wave of laughter through the group of Marines. Jenkins walked closer to Philip with exaggerated swagger, playing to his audience with body language that suggested he was about to deliver an entertaining performance. "Shooting. Sir, with all due respect, you can barely keep your hands steady enough to hold a coffee cup. What exactly do you think you're going to shoot with hands that shake like that?" Philip lifted his hands and examined them with the detached interest of someone observing a familiar but annoying limitation. The tremor was indeed visible, a constant slight movement that would seem to make precision rifle work impossible for anyone unfamiliar with techniques that compensated for age-related physical changes. "These old hands have fired more rounds than you've probably seen in your lifetime, son," Philip replied, with quiet dignity. "They remember what to do even when they shake a bit." Jenkins laughed harder, encouraged by the chuckles from his fellow Marines, who appreciated his public mockery of someone who clearly represented everything they believed they had surpassed through their youth and current service. "Sir, I mean no disrespect to your generation, but modern shooting requires physical capability well, that age tends to diminish. Maybe you should stick to telling war stories at the VFW rather than trying to handle weapons on an active range." The mention of war stories made Philip's expression shift almost imperceptibly, as if Jenkins had accidentally touched on something significant without understanding what he was referencing. But Philip's voice remained calm and courteous when he responded. "I'm waiting for General Davis. He knows I'm here, and he said I was welcome to use the range while I wait for him to finish his meeting." The claim to be waiting for the base commanding general struck Jenkins and his fellow Marines as obvious fabrication. A confused elderly man who had somehow wandered onto a military facility and was now making up important connections to justify his unauthorized presence. "General Davis," Jenkins repeated with exaggerated skepticism. "Sir, I'm sure General Davis has better things to do than meet with random civilians who show up at rifle ranges. Maybe you're confused about where you're supposed to be." Private Rodriguez finally found his voice despite his discomfort about contradicting his corporal in front of their peers. "Corporal Jenkins, maybe the gentleman does have legitimate business here. He's wearing a veteran jacket and he said he has permission to be on the range." Jenkins turned toward Rodriguez with the kind of sharp attention that made younger Marines regret speaking up in ways that could be interpreted as challenging their superiors. "Rodriguez, when I want your opinion about how to handle unauthorized personnel on our range, I'll ask for it specifically. Until then, focus on your own qualification scores, which need significant improvement." The public rebuke silenced Rodriguez and reinforced the group dynamic that made mockery of the elderly visitor feel like acceptable entertainment rather than cruel harassment of someone who deserved respect simply for his apparent veteran status and advanced age. Philip reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a laminated visitor pass that showed he had indeed been processed through proper base security procedures and authorized for access to Range 7 during specified hours. He held the pass out toward Jenkins without comment, allowing the documentation to speak for itself. Jenkins took the pass and examined it with obvious intent to find some irregularity that would justify his treatment of Philip and validate his assumption that the old man was either confused or fabricating his authorization to be present. What he saw was indeed a valid pass, properly issued and dated for that specific day, with General Davis listed as the sponsoring officer. But rather than acknowledging his error and moderating his behavior, Jenkins chose to interpret the valid documentation as evidence that someone in the administration office had made a mistake in processing Philip's request for base access. "This pass might be technically valid," Jenkins announced to his audience of fellow Marines, "but it's pretty clear that whoever issued it didn't understand that this gentleman isn't physically capable of safely using an active rifle range. For his own protection and ours, he should wait somewhere else for his meeting with General Davis, assuming that meeting actually exists." Philip's calm expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes suggested depths of experience that made Jenkins' confident mockery seem hollow, despite the laughter it generated from the watching Marines. The old man simply nodded with patient acceptance of treatment he had apparently encountered before, and he began to gather his belongings as if preparing to relocate to wherever Jenkins had decided was appropriate for someone of his age and apparent limitations. It was at that moment that Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Miller arrived at Range 7 to conduct his scheduled safety inspection of the facility and the Marines conducting qualification training. Miller was a career Marine with 18 years of service, and his reputation emphasized strict adherence to range safety protocols and aggressive enforcement of regulations regarding unauthorized personnel in training areas. Howie! Miller immediately noticed the elderly civilian sitting on the bench with several Marines gathered around him in what appeared to be some kind of confrontation, rather than proper range training activity. His expression showed irritation as he approached the group with purposeful stride that indicated someone preparing to address a situation that violated his expectations for proper facility operations. "What's going on here, Corporal Jenkins?" Miller demanded as he reached the group, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance with his questions. Jenkins straightened to attention reflexively before responding with confidence that suggested he believed his behavior would be validated by his sergeant's intervention. "Gunnery Sergeant, we have an elderly civilian who claims he's waiting for General Davis and wants to use the range despite obvious physical limitations that make him a safety concern. I was just explaining that he needs to wait elsewhere." Miller turned his attention to Philip, and his assessment of the situation aligned immediately with Jenkins' characterization. What he saw was an old man with trembling hands, wearing clothes that suggested limited resources, occupying space on an active training range where his presence represented potential safety issues and distraction for Marines who needed to focus on qualification requirements. "Sir," Miller addressed Philip with a kind of forced courtesy that barely disguised his irritation, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave this range immediately. Regardless of whatever pass you think you have, this is an active training facility, and unauthorized civilians create safety concerns that I can't tolerate." Philip held out his visitor pass once more, but Miller barely glanced at it before dismissing its significance with a wave of his hand that suggested bureaucratic documentation meant nothing compared to his professional judgment about range safety and appropriate facility use. "That pass doesn't override my authority to maintain safety on this range," Miller announced. "You need to leave now, or I'll call military police to escort you off this facility." As Miller spoke, his eyes fell on the faded patch on Philip's jacket shoulder, the ghost silhouette over the river delta map that had deteriorated to near invisibility through years of wear. Miller reached out and touched the patch with his finger, in a gesture that mixed curiosity and contempt. "What's this supposed to be?" Miller asked with obvious mockery. "Some kind of a retiree shooting club badge? Did you buy this jacket at a surplus store?" The physical contact with the patch triggered something profound in Philip's consciousness, and his expression shifted as memories flooded back with the intensity of experiences that had been carefully contained but never forgotten. The moment Gunnery Sergeant Miller's finger touched the faded ghost insignia on Philip's jacket, the old man's mind was transported backward through decades to a steaming jungle where that same patch had been sewn onto a young Marine's uniform by trembling hands, working by flashlight in the darkness between enemy patrols. In his memory, Philip was 22 years old, crouched in dense vegetation that dripped with humidity and concealed threats that moved silently through the night. His battle buddy Marcus Chen sat beside him, bleeding from a shrapnel wound that Philip was treating with supplies that were running dangerously low after 3 weeks of operations deep in enemy territory without resupply or extraction. "Promise me something," Marcus had whispered as Philip worked on his wounds, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood he might not survive the night. "If I don't make it out of here, you make sure they remember what we did. Not for glory, but so the families know their sons died for something that mattered." Philip had sewn that ghost patch onto Marcus's jacket that night as a symbol of their unit's official designation. Men who operated in places that didn't officially exist, conducting missions that would never appear in public records, fighting battles that history would never acknowledge because admitting they occurred would reveal operations that remained classified decades later. Sir, are you listening to me?" Miller's voice pulled Philip back to the present, where he found the gunnery sergeant staring at him with irritation that had transformed into something approaching alarm at the old man's momentary absence from the conversation. "I'm listening, Sergeant," Philip replied quietly, his voice carrying undertones that suggested he had just returned from places that Miller couldn't begin to comprehend, despite his own combat deployments and military experience. Then you heard me tell you to leave this range immediately. Miller snapped, his patience exhausted by what he perceived as deliberate non-compliance with his legitimate safety concerns. I don't care what documentation you think you have or who you claim to be meeting. You're leaving now, voluntarily or with military police assistance. Philip stood slowly, his aged body protesting the movement after sitting in the heat for over an hour. But as he gathered his belongings and prepared to comply with Miller's order, the sergeant made a decision that would prove catastrophic to his career and his reputation within the Corps. Miller reached out and grabbed Philip's arm, intending to physically guide him away from the range area with enough force to make it clear that this was not a request, but a command, backed by immediate physical enforcement, if necessary. The grip on his arm triggered another flashback for Philip, being grabbed by enemy soldiers during the ambush that had killed Marcus and 3 other members of their team. The beginning of captivity that would last months before a classified prisoner exchange that officially never occurred allowed his return to American forces. Philip's body tensed with old reflexes, and for just a moment, Miller felt the elderly man's arm become steel under his grip. Not the frail limb he had expected, but something that suggested reserves of strength and training that decades hadn't completely erased. "Sergeant," Philip said quietly, his voice carrying warning that Miller was too angry to recognize. "I'd appreciate it if you'd remove your hand from my arm." But Miller interpreted the request as defiance rather than courtesy, and his grip tightened as he prepared to physically escort Philip off the range, regardless of the old man's cooperation or resistance. It was at that moment that civilian base employee Robert Henderson walked past Range 7 on his way to the armory office, his attention drawn by the unusual sight of a gunnery sergeant physically restraining an elderly visitor, while young Marines watched with obvious discomfort about what they were witnessing. Henderson was a military history enthusiast who spent his free time researching classified operations that had been gradually declassified over the decades, and he had developed extensive knowledge about special operations units whose existence had been denied during their active service, but whose achievements were slowly being acknowledged as historical records became available to researchers. As Henderson moved closer to observe the confrontation, he noticed the name on Philip's visitor pass that was still visible in Miller's other hand: Philip Lawson. The name triggered immediate recognition in Henderson's memory, connecting to documents he had read just weeks earlier about Project Chimera, a classified special operations program that had conducted deep penetration missions in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam conflict. Henderson felt his stomach drop as he realized that Miller was physically manhandling someone whose name appeared in classified after-action reports as one of the most effective operators in Marine Corps Special Operations history. Without hesitation, Henderson pulled out his cell phone and dialed directly to General Davis's office, bypassing normal protocols, because he understood the urgency of preventing further escalation of a situation that could have profound consequences. "General Davis's office, how may I help you?" The aide's voice carried professional courtesy, mixed with the expectation that this call would be routine administrative business. "This is Robert Henderson from Base Historical Archives. I need to speak with General Davis immediately regarding Philip Lawson, who is currently at Range 7, being physically detained by range safety personnel." The mention of Philip Lawson's name had the same effect on the aide that it had on Henderson. Immediate recognition of significance that transcended normal visitor protocols. "Hold please, Mr. Henderson. I'm connecting you directly to the General." Within seconds, General Davis's voice came on the line with urgency that suggested he understood exactly why this call was being made. "Henderson, where is Mr. Lawson right now and what's his current situation?" "Sir, he's at Range 7, being physically detained by Gunnery Sergeant Miller, who appears to be preparing to have him removed from the facility by military police. The situation looks like it's escalating rapidly." Henderson heard what sounded like General Davis slamming his hand on his desk with enough force to rattle everything on its surface. "Tell Miller not to touch that man and to keep him exactly where he is until I arrive. I'm leaving immediately with full escort." The call ended, leaving Henderson holding his phone while watching Miller continue to grip Philip's arm, despite the old man's quiet request for release. Henderson moved closer and called out with enough authority to draw the sergeant's attention. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller, I just spoke with General Davis, and he's ordered you to release Mr. Lawson immediately and ensure he remains comfortable at range 7 until the general arrives personally." Miller turned toward Henderson with obvious irritation at civilian interference in what he considered a military security matter. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but range safety is my responsibility, and I've determined that this individual poses a security and safety risk that requires his immediate removal." Henderson took a deep breath and delivered information that he hoped would prevent further escalation before General Davis arrived. "Sergeant, Philip Lawson is a Marine Corps legend whose classified service record makes him one of the most significant operators in Corps history. If you continue to detain him or attempt to remove him from this facility, you will be ending your career in the most catastrophic way possible." Miller's grip on Philip's arm loosened slightly as doubt began to creep into his confident authority, but his pride and his commitment to his initial judgment kept him from backing down completely. "I don't care what legends you've heard about, Mr. Henderson. My responsibility is range safety, and elderly civilians with trembling hands don't belong on active firing ranges." But the sound of approaching vehicles had begun to penetrate the confrontation, drawing everyone's attention toward the access road where a convoy was moving toward range 7 at high speed, with the kind of urgency that indicated genuine emergency response rather than routine base traffic. In his office, General Davis exploded from his chair when Henderson mentioned Philip Lawson's name. "Get my vehicle ready immediately and notify the Sergeant Major I need full escort at range 7 within 5 minutes, he ordered while grabbing his cap. Davis called the Commandant's office on secure line. Code Sierra situation involving a Project Chimera veteran. Philip Lawson is being detained by personnel who don't understand who they're dealing with." His convoy arrived at range 7 with sirens and precision. Davis emerged before the vehicle stopped, his 4-star rank commanding immediate attention from every Marine who snapped to attention. But Davis ignored everyone, walking directly to Philip. He came to perfect attention and rendered the most formal salute any Marine present had witnessed. "Chief Lawson, it is an honor, sir. A profound and humbling honor." Philip returned the salute with movements shedding decades, revealing the Marine he'd been. When Davis lowered his salute, he turned toward Miller with expression that made the sergeant go pale, understanding his treatment of Lawson had been career-ending. Davis addressed the assembled Marines with barely contained fury. "You are in the presence of Chief Sergeant Philip Lawson, retired. During Vietnam and classified operations, he served in one of the most secret units in Marine Corps history, Project Chimera, the Ghosts of Mekong. Chief Lawson holds the Navy Cross, 3 Silver Stars, 5 Purple Hearts. His confirmed eliminations exceed 150, including high-ranking enemy officers. He was captured, held in a secret prison, declared killed in action, until a classified exchange brought him home." Davis turned to Miller with cold fury. Today, this legend was physically manhandled by a sergeant who judged him on trembling hands and old clothes, rather than recognizing that true greatness carries itself with quiet dignity. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller, you're relieved pending investigation. Every Marine who mocked Chief Lawson will write a 5,000-word essay on Special Operations history and personally apologize." Davis addressed Philip. "Chief Lawson, you mentioned wanting to shoot. What weapon would you prefer?" Philip smiled slightly. "Standard rifle is fine, General. Same as these young Marines." Philip approached the firing line, selected a standard rifle, checked it with practiced efficiency, and assumed standing position without support at the 500-yard line. 10 shots. 10 perfect center hits. The watching Marines stood stunned as Philip demonstrated skill that made their scores seem amateur. The elderly man with trembling hands had delivered a masterclass in marksmanship, transcending physical limitations through decades of training. The range erupted in applause, not mocking laughter, but genuine respect from young warriors who just learned about judging capability based on appearance. 3 weeks later, the base newspaper acknowledged Philip's visit with formal apology. Miller was reassigned to administrative duties, his career ended by loss of respect from fellow Marines. Jenkins and other young Marines completed essays and personally apologized, their genuine remorse suggesting they'd learned lasting lessons. Weeks later, Miller encountered Philip at the base coffee shop. "Chief Lawson, I know I have no right to speak with you, but I wanted to apologize again. My behavior was inexcusable." Philip gestured to the empty chair. "We all make mistakes, son. The question isn't whether you made errors. It's what you learn and how you treat people differently going forward. What should I have seen that would have told me who you were?" Philip smiled gently. "You shouldn't have needed to see anything except a fellow human being deserving basic respect and courtesy. My service record is classified, and I never expected recognition. I just expected basic dignity that any veteran, any person, deserves regardless of age or appearance. Would you tell me about the ghosts of Mekong?" Philip began sharing stories, not about combat, but about the men he'd served with, their fears and hopes, their humanity facing impossible missions. Miller listened with complete attention, receiving education about military service that couldn't be found in any manual. Both understood they'd come full circle from contempt to respect, from judgment based on appearance to appreciation based on character. Later, Philip stood alone at Range 7 as the sun set, looking at targets that had witnessed his 10 perfect shots. His trembling hands rested on the rail, his weathered face reflecting decades of memories about operations that would remain classified, brothers who would never be publicly honored, and a life of service that had demanded everything, but sought no reward beyond knowledge that he'd been faithful to his oath and his brothers. The ghost insignia on his jacket remained faded and nearly invisible, just as the men who wore it had operated, unseen, unacknowledged, but absolutely essential to protecting freedoms that others enjoyed, without understanding the price paid in blood and silence by warriors whose names would never appear in history books, but whose legacy lived on in the values they embodied through decades of faithful service.